I now want to invite up Dr. Dan Walters. He's a professor of geography at Nipissing University. Dan is a member of the Technical Advisory Committee of the North Bay Mattawa Source Water Protection Region. And Dan will present on emerging water quality issues in the Magan region, specifically blue algae. I know we all think about blue algae in this region and how it threatens the social, economic, environmental values of lakes.
Okay, thanks, Robin. Before I begin, as Robin mentioned, I'm a faculty member at Nipissing University in the Department of Geography. My primary area of research is in water policy. I happen to be part of a team of faculty members from across Ontario that look specifically at the issue of cyanobacteria. What are the drivers that are causing the formation, in particular in central Ontario, as we'll see from a map in a few minutes. But my work is really on the policy side. How do we, when we identify lakes that frequently bloom, what's the system in place in order to prevent or mitigate those from happening? So I'll kind of run through this quickly, and if there's any questions on both the science or policy, I'd be happy to address them then or even in the discussion later on. So one of the things we can see, the orange circle at the top represents sort of the Almaguin region, and one of the unique things about this area is it's not covered by a Conservation Authority district, right? And in Ontario, what we've done is moved over towards the Clean Water Act and having conservation authorities taking a greater role in protecting our water systems. But despite being called the Clean Water Act, we specifically are only interested in protecting municipal drinking water supplies. So if your source of water is a municipal source of water, you're going to get some attention in making sure issues are addressed. A lot of the work that I'm doing right now with my colleague, Dr. April James at Nipissing University, as well as colleagues at York University, is looking at the cyanobacteria blooms in Callender Bay, because it is a source water supply for the municipality of Callender itself. So if it was not the source water supply for the municipality of Callender, it would not be getting nearly the amount of attention it does right now. So one of the things, the questions I have in a recent grant application was successful is, how do municipalities or regions that don't fall within the conservation of their boundaries address cyanobacteria blooms? If it's not a drinking water supply, it's, maybe your cottage is drawing direct water from that lake, but that doesn't count as a municipal system. So today, in the few minutes, 5 minutes or so, 10 minutes that I have, I want to focus on the science. So what's our current understanding of why cyanobacteria blooms are becoming more dominant in this particular region, and it's not unique to this area, as well as then on the policy side of things, how do we go about addressing those, and what are some options preventing blooms from happening? So this is a map that doesn't identify particular lakes, because the databases that we work with, the government, they don't want us to publish specific lakes that have blooms, because there's a reputational impact associated with that, right? If you search Wassy Lake, you're probably going to come across in the first few hits that Wassy Lake had an algal bloom. And if you're looking for a place to rent or take your family to in the summertime, that's not something you initially want to see, or you might be looking at other places to go, right? Eagle Lake recently has bloomed. Lake Bernard has also bloomed in this region. And so we can see from this map that central Ontario seems to be an area where we're seeing the emerging threats. Right, a report published in 2011 identified that since 1994, the greatest number of reported cyanobacteria blooms has been in central Ontario. All right? And it's important to say reported because these means that these are lakes that are occupied, maybe have cottages on them, someone was there, noticed it, called into the ministry, someone came and grabbed a sample, lab analysis shows that cyanobacteria were present, and so it gets a flag or an issue warning associated with that, and we'll look at the warning system that's put in place. All right, so why is it happening in this area? So a few questions I want to answer in the short period of time I have here. What are cyanobacteria? Why are they dominant in some particular lakes? And what are the socioeconomic impacts associated with those blooms, and how do we manage cyanobacteria in Ontario? I'll see what I can do in 5 minutes. All right, so these are procreates. They are not, they are called a blue-green algae, but they're not algae, they're bacteria, right? So that just means that they don't have any nuclear structure to contain the DNA and RNA material. So they're simple single-cell organisms. They've evolved and are essential to the formation of our atmosphere. They provided oxygen and made this planet inhabitable. So they developed and adapted and evolved over about 3.5 billion years. And so they're prevalent in both freshwater systems and marine systems, right? So you're probably aware of some of the large algal blooms that occur on Lake Erie. So this is one of the larger ones from 2011. But it's a reoccurring basis. This started in the 1970s, largely due to agricultural runoff and the eutrophication of the lake, right? The more phosphorus there is in lakes, the more productive they are, the more biomass they can produce. So you're more likely to have cyanobacteria blooms in lakes that have a lot of phosphorus in them. Right? There are over 2,000 varieties or species of cyanobacteria, of which less than 50 are toxic varieties. So just because it's identified as a cyanobacteria bloom doesn't necessarily mean that it was a toxic variety. That requires specific laboratory analysis, which the Ministry of the Environment does, right? As I mentioned earlier, someone calls in a complaint. They think what they see is algae on the lake. Someone comes and grabs a sample, and about 2 weeks later, they'll determine whether or not that was a toxic variety or not, or the toxins were in the water themselves. Especially in this region, you'll get a lot of misreporting. Pollen collection on lakes sometimes looks like a mat of algae, and so those get called in from time to time. But there needs to be a required specific analysis to determine whether those are present or not. Right? So here's 2 examples of 2 strains that are known to be toxic. Microsystem, specifically Microsystem LR, is what we test for here in Canada. That's the only toxic variety of cyanobacteria that we're looking for that's regulated. Right? So if that's present in your water supply, you're going to get notice or formed public to say you've got a toxic variety of cyanobacteria, so do not consume, do not swim. You can't boil the water, right? So what that actually does is it releases the toxins that are in the cells, so boiling the water actually makes it more toxic than it would if you just left them undisturbed, right? So don't boil, do not consume, that's not going to make your water clean. What are some of the unique aspects of it? These are the only prokaryotes that will perform photosynthesis, right? So they can actually generate and produce oxygen using the sunlight, carbon, and water. They have gas vesicles in their systems that allow them to move themselves up and down the water column. This is really important for cyanobacteria because one of the fuel sources they get access to is at the bottom of the lake during anoxic conditions. So low oxygen, has some chemical reactions. It makes iron available, particularly ferrous iron, which is important for the metabolism of cyanobacteria. They go down to the bottom of the lake where there's anoxic or low oxygen levels, can consume the phosphates and the iron that's there, and then they can move back up into the photic zone or the light zone and multiply. And so that's the general understanding of the importance or mechanisms that are contributing to cyanobacteria blooms. Right? We also have N-fixing and non-N-fixing varieties. So it means that if you have a low nitrogen concentration in your lake, you can have the N-fixing varieties because much like agricultural crops, legumes, they can fix nitrogen from the atmosphere. Well, so can these N-fixing varieties of cyanobacteria, which can also then produce toxins. So they're a well-evolved sort of creature that can live in many, many environments. You might also recently heard of red tides out in BC. So here's an example of one in 2018 off of Bowen Island. This was a non-toxic variety, but it affects shellfish industries enormously in coastal areas, and there's a lot of efforts to prevent those going forward. So what do we know about cyanobacteria? Why do they grow in particularly certain environments? As I mentioned, they're more likely to be present in eutrophic environments, which means heavily nutrient-laden lakes. And particularly phosphorus is the key nutrient that we're looking at. So we often think of Lake Erie as being a eutrophic lake, and that is one of the reasons why we see cyanobacteria blooms generated in those lakes. But the other thing that we notice, and some of you might be familiar with Dixon Lake in Algonquin Park, not a lot of development activity around that particular lake, so it doesn't have a lot of human influence on that lake, but it's bloomed several times in the last few years. So this has raised a lot of interest in why a non-eutrophic lake seems to be blooming. And so there has to be some other mechanism involved in order to why cyanobacteria are being dominant. So phosphorus is important, but there's another element as well that's key. So why do we know the things we know about cyanobacteria blooms? Well, all the work that's been gone up in experimental lakes in Northern Ontario, which the previous federal government had pulled the funding from, and the provincial government here has helped support to maintain the work that's gone on since the 1970s. It's also, and there's many lakes up in this particular region. It's also the area where they've looked at the microbeads in water quality and the effects of bioaccumulation in fish. So the experimental lakes are really sort of outstanding in terms of getting a better understanding of what the drivers are, particularly in the era of climate change, that are creating the changes in the mix of our lakes. So if it's not only driven by phosphorus, what's the other element? And the current research, our best understanding is that it's triggered by a release of ferrous iron. Iron is prevalent in the environment all the time, but it's usually in a form that's bound to other metal hydroxides, so it's not freely floating around. It's not something that algae can scavenge and use as a metabolism or a fuel that they can use to grow. So under these certain conditions, which are called anoxic conditions, so at the bottom of the lake, if you're fishers, you want to have oxygen temperature between 4 and 7 is ideal for fish. But when you get down to those bottom sediments where there's no sunlight, there's no photosynthesis going on, all that's being consumed is the oxygen down there by consuming organic matter. And that's not being replaced by any oxygen. So oxygen levels keep going lower and lower and lower, and all of a sudden there's no oxygen, you get these chemical reactions happening. So iron gets converted from a form called ferric iron, which is bound, to one that's now free-floating called ferrous iron, which now cyanobacteria can scavenge, right? So they can use that to grow and develop and outcompete against eutrophic or regular nuisance algae, and they become then dominant in these lakes. So that's our current, at least, understanding of the science around cyanobacteria. It's both the availability of phosphorus in our water systems, but also then the availability of ferrous iron in order to scavenge and grow and outcompete other forms of algae. So if we look at this top diagram, it's a nice simple model to determine which lakes might be more prone to having algal blooms if they have high levels of total of phosphorus loading coming into them. And those can be natural sources. Wetlands are sources of phosphorus. The leaves, when they fall off the trees, are a source of phosphorus when they dissolve and go into waterways. So it's not always triggered by human activity. There can be natural sources of phosphorus as well in our water systems. So if it's a high level, so you have high productivity, high potential for biomass to develop. If you have anoxic sediments, which means you're going to have the release, because there's iron is in the sediments of every lake. Like we did an experiment of taking samples from across Canada, looking at iron levels, and there's no lakes that are deficient in iron, right? Whether in an urban environment or a non-urban environment. It's just naturally ubiquitous in the environment. So the anoxic sediments release the iron. Cyanobacteria can now scavenge both the phosphorus and iron, ferrous iron in the water column, and it's more likely that cyanobacteria will dominate in those types of lakes. On the other side of the equation, if you have a low productivity lake, so low levels of phosphorus, you don't have anoxic sediments, so they're well oxygenated, so that just means there's a lot of mixing of the surface waters with the bottom water, so there's always high levels of oxygenated water in your water column. So you wouldn't have that chemical reaction happening. So your iron is going to stay in the form of ferric iron. It's going to stay bound. It's not going to be mobile or available to be uptake by plants. And so those are going to be more likely to be dominated by eutrophic phytoplankton. Right? Communities, which are nuisance, but they're not going to be toxic varieties or cause any human health issues associated with it. The other factor, algal blooms or cyanobacteria tend to outcompete green algae at higher temperatures, but the main important drivers are phosphorus and iron availability. But climate change, the warming of lakes, there's lots of fuel for cyanobacteria blooms in the spring, but the lakes are still too cold, right? So you've got all that spring freshet running off all the decayed material that's developed under the snow over the wintertime. Well, the lakes are just too cold, they can't utilize it. Now what's happening with climate change, we've heard this a statement called the brownification of lakes. What's happening today is our leaves are falling off the trees sooner in the fall. Our rain events are coming after that, and that's flushing then fuel sources, potentially iron, phosphorus, into our lakes. And so that's why you're starting to see blooms sometime now in October, in November. It's because of the change of climate, and leaves are falling, but the rains are still coming at the similar time. So you're flushing all these nutrients into lakes. Lakes are warmer, so now cyanobacteria can take advantage of these situations. All right? So if you have a bloom, and if you live on a lake that has bloomed, and you were so unfortunate to get one of these advisories posted on the shoreline, these are issued by the Ministry of the local health units to advise individuals to be cautious when operating or working or being around these lakes, right? Do not swim. Do not allow your pets to consume it. As I've mentioned, you can't boil to get rid of the toxins. And so this is a struggle for those, especially who draw water directly from these lakes. How do they get access to safe supplies of drinking water? It has profound economic impacts. There's anecdotal evidence of house deals not going through on Lake Simcoe because of people's concerns about the water quality conditions. Real estate agents are often being asked questions when anybody's looking for a home on a waterfront property about water quality is now a key question that they're getting asked. People want to know about the history of that lake. Cottage associations don't want notices posted because it affects the rental rates or values. The ability to rent their cottage in the summertime, if someone knows it's a lake that blooms, you'll probably move on to another lake. So now people don't want to necessarily even report the fact that blooms are happening because they don't want the stigma associated with that. So clearly, it has a profound economic impact on regions that both develop on the economic value of the trade industry or just real estate values, or those that are using for camp or tourism recreational opportunities. Japan actually stopped exporting or importing fish from Lake Erie a couple years ago when it was harvests that were collected during a cyanobacteria bloom. So there's concerns about bioaccumulation of cyanotoxins in fish, and then what are the impacts then of people consuming or fishing in those particular regions. Sudbury, so Lake Ramsey blooms. It's the drinking water supply for Sudbury. And now you're just starting, people are to adapting to the fact that cyanobacteria blooms are in their waterways. As I've mentioned, there's a small number of them that are actually toxic varieties. So just because you have cyanobacteria there doesn't necessarily mean that the toxin will be present. What do we have in place here in the province to prevent or mitigate against those blooms? Well, the government has put together a 12-point action plan, which is really just a combination of existing laws and legislation that was already in place. We don't have a cyanobacteria regulations or anything related to that. It was just nutrient management for the farming sector, trying to ensure that public health is aware and makes notification to the public to stay away. And as I mentioned at the beginning of this talk, in most cases, it's going to fall in the jurisdiction of a conservation authority. So the question that we have in moving forward this coming summer will be, what strategies have municipalities that don't fall under a conservation authority guideline? How are they sort of implementing some strategies or roles to prevent these activities? So in many ways, what John was talking about this morning about strategic economic development plans being developed locally with local initiatives, it's the same thing with water resource management plans these days as well. It's up to local water cottage associations or groups to trying to determine what's the best and most effective means by which to minimize water quality issues within their area. So we can see the area of the Omaguen region has numerous lakes and water bodies that are utilized for recreational and tourism opportunities, but unfortunately it seems to be an area also where we've seen this unfortunate increase in cyanobacteria blooms. And the question is, what are the local capacity then of various municipalities to address these issues when you don't have the same provincial support network you do if you fall within a conservation authority boundary? So just in terms of final thoughts, phosphorus, which has been the approach for preventing cyanobacteria blooms since the 1970s, came out of a lot of the work that was done around Lake Erie. So yes, we still need to look at phosphorus control and maintaining healthy systems. But the other important feature we need to now consider look at more closely is oxygen in water bodies. So instead of just taking your TP samples or total phosphorus samples at the beginning of the season, we need to more routinely be monitoring the oxygen levels at the bottom of lakes, because that's what then can trigger the onset of cyanobacteria blooms. And this work has been both developed and sort of relates to work that's gone on in Georgian Bay with a colleague, Luke Malott, who's experienced or seen this evidence from a wide range of lake systems. It's the onset of an anoxic event, release of iron, which then within about 2 weeks of that triggers your algal blooms. And so we've been doing this work in Calendar Bay for the last few years. And so we're seeing the exact same results that he's seeing in a number of these eutrophic systems or non-eutrophic systems as well. Best way to address these, still, I know BMPs or best management practice in the agricultural sector have been talked about for a long period of time, but these are the most effective ways in which to minimize phosphorus loading into our lakes, as well as some in situ technology. What you're trying to do in that case is bring your unoxygenated water from the bottom to the surface so it gets exposed to atmosphere and gets access to some oxygen, or you take your oxygenated surface water and you pump them down into the bottom of the lake, and that provides then the oxygenated water there, and then you don't get the release of the iron and then not the onset of the blooms. So there's my sort of brief overview of right now our current understanding of the science of cyanobacteria and briefly on how we manage them in the province. Thanks.